I'm all about remembering. We live in a country that's notorious for not remembering its past. Never before has the United States been as pastless as it is right now. I feel a desperate need to revisit the American past, to somehow find the roots that we lack. So the study of 19th century American music, this remains pretty much an untilled terrain. We were late to do it, and we still don't do it sufficiently. The whole story of Bristow, or the story of Henry Higginson, or the story of Theodore Thomas, or the story of Anton Seidel, these stories are not nearly as well known as they need to be.
The triumph of the American Revolution brought independence to the colonies, allowing for a new political identity to capture the imagination of millions. And before the ink on the British Articles of Capitulation would dry, a new class of creative individuals was already praising the triumphs and glories of the Revolution, as artists have done since the beginning of time. Thomas Jefferson drew inspiration from the ancient world for models that could embody the ideals of the new republic. The result was a style defined by history in classical terms, temples of learning and government built not for kings but for citizens, where proportion and order became the visual language of freedom. A generation later, the search for meaning turned inward. In the wilderness, writers discovered a new transcendental vision of the self and the divine. From those meditations came the first truly American voices, restless and imaginative, rising from the moral shadows of the past toward the ecstatic promise of democracy. Painters across the land were now morphing rivers, mountains, and valleys into sublime expressions of a shared destiny, revealing the wilderness not as wilderness at all, but as the living soul of the Republic. Meanwhile, sculptors were giving permanent form in bronze and stone to American heroes, much as other nations have done from the dawn of time. Photography first and motion pictures later began to document the process itself. All the while, a distinctly American soundtrack was quietly taking shape in the background, heard in popular airs drifting through parlors and taverns, in hymns and oratorios sung in churches, and in the spirituals rising from the fields. Across the countryside, black fiddlers carried melodies born on plantations across the South. Meanwhile, the soundtrack that animated Boston was that of European symphonies, while in New York, Italian operas and orchestras dominated a growing number of concert halls and theaters. This emerging sound found champions among a growing number of musicians inspired by the great masters who would plant the seeds for the earliest American compositions. Among its very pioneers was the son of English immigrants, a virtuoso violinist and teacher. His name was Bristow, George Frederick Bristow.
George Frederick Bristow was a name that I'd only seen in a textbook. I'd never heard a line of his music, knew nothing about him, except that he existed, and he played an important role in the development of classical music. I didn't know a line of his music. The first American composers I encountered as a musician growing up were 20th century Americans. They were Charles Ives, George Gershwin, Aaron Copland. They were living parts of the 20th century. I couldn't name you a single 19th century American composer. I never played any music by any of them. And I only knew they existed by history, in a history book.
Okay. Are you asking the question? Where was he?
You wrote this book, right?
Right, I did write this book. My understanding is that the family lived in Brooklyn. Then by 1834, which is when George was about 6 or 7, they moved to Lower Manhattan and lived in a variety of places in Lower Manhattan. His father was a performing and composing musician, William Bristow. He was quite a good clarinetist, but he also played organ, a number of other instruments, probably piano, and was a theater musician as well as a church organist. And he composed quite a few pieces. In fact, George talks about his father as being a very accomplished musician, and he was accomplished in New York and in Brooklyn as well.
My father was indeed a distinguished musician. He taught the organ, clarinet, and piano to support the family. He composed masses and Te Deums and arranged music for orchestra and military bands. He hoped I would also become a good musician, and to spark the will of Providence, he named me after George Frederick Handel.
He spent his entire career in the city of New York. His training was in the city of New York. So he had a great influence from European musicians, many of whom visited New York City, and many of whom had immigrated from, say, England or France or Germany to New York. And so he learned music, Western art music, from many of these performers, but he never went to Europe to be trained.
The German immigration was the largest immigration of the mid-century until the wave of immigration from Italy and from Eastern Europe. Of course, there was the Irish immigration. So these communities, having been uprooted from the places they came, created communities of their own here and invented things that bound them together: language, ancestry. And in the German-speaking community, particularly, but also the English-speaking community, they brought with them the kind of church music that they did, and the dance music that they grew up with. And then they come to America and they meet two populations. One is the indigenous population, and then the slave population and the freed slave population that come from different traditions that come through Africa and sometimes through the Caribbean. And then they meet other European traditions, which they didn't really have much contact with. German immigration from Bavaria or from the Rhineland, meet someone from Sicily or Naples.
Right now, we're celebrating the American Revolution and asking ourselves, what was it about? We used to know, we no longer do. I think probably the ideal of freedom is still essential to American identity because we don't have an ethnic identity. And if anything unifies us, it's partly the idea that people could determine their own destiny and that Americans could free themselves from British rule. But it's all contested. My particular frustration is that the arts, which traditionally help nations figure out who they are so devalued and marginalized right now that we don't have the help of creative expression, of creative artists in defining and understanding and experiencing America.
This is, are we rolling? This is very much the sort of music that Thomas Jefferson would have had in his house. I'll do that again.
There it is, a chromatic ramble of the Peregrine Harmonist by A.P. Heinrich.
There were those who went and studied in Europe and those who didn't. The real thing of going to Europe and studying in Europe did not become a fashion until the second half of the 19th century. The above is a fragment from a manuscript which the author has not been able yet to publish, entitled The Statesman's Resignation to Death, set to elegiac music and occasioned by reading the philosophical correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. Bristow never studied in Europe. But Heinrich was exclusively educated in Europe. But then he wrote all of his music in the United States. In one way, we're the same culture, in one way, we're not. Right? And I think the big difference is the wilderness and the sense of space. He had the direct impact of the wilderness, which shows in his music. But in the case of Bristow, he knew the wilderness was there. He had some experience of it, but he didn't actually live in Kentucky, for example. But he knew about this, and he knew that, west of the Hudson, it was wide open spaces. This is the Battle of Trenton, a favorite historical military sonata, and it had a certain circulation. It's still played from time to time. I think it's an excellent example of the battle piece, which is not a high-class piece of music. It's probably the most high-class one is Wellington's Victory by Beethoven, but Beethoven himself considered it a bagatelle, and his contemporaries considered it beneath his dignity, which infuriated Beethoven. The Army in Motion. And then General Orders. Washington's March. Etc. The American Army crossing the Delaware.
People had not that many keyboard instruments. They did have flutes. There was a lot of flute playing going on in Connecticut in the 18th century and in New England in general. You may know that Thoreau played the flute, and he was quite good, actually. People played oboes. People did not play clarinets because they hadn't been invented yet. There were some string instruments that were played, mostly violins and cellos, a few harpsichords here and there, and a few pianos, but the keyboards were very, very expensive. There were only a small number of organs, but they were generally speaking in churches, not in municipal buildings or in homes.
Which composers were their favorites?
Thomas Arne, William Boyce, English composers of the time. The American composers come in at the end of the 18th century. Francis Hopkinson is generally considered the first composer in American composer. He was a personal friend of George Washington, and he wrote a set of songs that's dedicated to Washington. They're still sung from time to time. Very attractive music. You know the tune British Grenadiers. Da 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 dum ba da bum ba da dee dum. Everybody knew that tune, right? And even though it was an English tune, it was sung by American troops in the Civil War.
As soon as I was ready to approach the piano, my father taught me to play God Save the King, one finger on each hand. The family, as you may have guessed, was of solid British stock. You should have seen the pride with which he sat beside me, as though I were the reincarnation of Mozart himself, with the weight of future greatness resting squarely on my small shoulders.
So if you're trying to trace the evolution of classical music and the composition of classical music in the United States in the 19th century, you first think about Germans and the immigration of Germans who create singing societies and orchestras. The Germania Orchestra that visits in the 1840s, that's a key event. And Americans begin to compose music for orchestra. In the mid-century, there are 4 Americans who are most prominent undertaking that challenge. And they are George Bristow, Louis Moreau Gottschalk, Anthony Philip Heinrich, and William Henry Fry. And the most conservative of them is Bristow. The other 2 were like self-made maniacs. So Fry writes the Santa Claus Symphony, which is a delightful piece. And Heinrich is also writing music that we would consider to be highly eccentric. But all 3 of them, unlike Gottschalk, are responding to the Germanic influence.
By the early 1840s, New York was more than the busiest maritime port in the Western Hemisphere, and beneath the noise of commerce, something else was taking root. A permanent symphony orchestra, along with expanding chamber music societies, offered a continuing repertoire of European composers, while theater companies shared the stage with opera troupes that captured the imagination of a growing intellectual class of music aficionados. Writers were part of the same cultural ferment. Walt Whitman, a Brooklyner and contemporary of George Bristow, attended performances of Donizetti and Verdi operas in New York, absorbing the vitality of a city whose musical life was rapidly expanding. Edgar Allan Poe reviewed opera with a keen understanding of vocal technique and dramatic presentation. Poe believed music to be the most powerful art for expressing beauty and mood, a philosophy that shaped his approach to poetry and its musicality.
You know, my interest as a composer has always been in Bristow's music, but you look at his life, he was doing a lot of things besides composing. He was one of the major conductors in New York. He was involved with all these societies. He helped found the Brooklyn Philharmonic. He taught all of his life. He died literally in the classroom. But you know what? One of the things that impressed me about him early on was that in 1854, he resigned from the New York Philharmonic to protest their refusal to honor American composers, their refusal to play American music. And I was so impressed that he would make that sacrifice. He later went back to the Philharmonic. I think he was away from it for 18 months. I've always respected Bristow for stepping down from such an important position. He was concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic.
By the mid-1840s, Manhattan's architectural landscape was undergoing a profound transformation. Wooden and brick buildings were giving way to innovative cast iron structures. By then, Bristow, in his early 20s, was already established as a violin virtuoso, and he was thriving in the creative milieu. The center of New York's intellectual and artistic life was very much alive on Broadway, and in these buildings housing concert halls, theaters, publishing houses, and the studios of pioneer photographers.
The British were not happy with Italian opera, and so they spoke against Italian opera, which was dominant in New York, even in the 1840s. You know, so there's always been a kind of argument about what is American and what isn't American. Do American composers compose European music? Or are they trying to compose American music? If so, what is American music? Okay, so it's the same kind of issue that we face. American music is on American topics. So when he writes the Symphony No. 4, the Acadian Symphony, that deals with Americans going across the continent. When he writes Rip Van Winkle, his opera, he's writing an American story. So does that make it American music? I don't know.
What is American becomes an issue only post-Civil War in a serious way, when America emerges as a big industrial international force in the 1890s, 1880s. And for most of that time, Americans have a little bit of an insecurity because they look to Europe as the mature place of high culture. That's where there were Greeks and Romans, and that's where there was the Renaissance, and that's where Raphael and Leonardo da Vinci and Dürer, that somehow this was high culture. This is the world of Shakespeare, of Goethe, of Corneille, Racine. So Bristow does the natural thing, takes the forms that were developed in Europe and tries to invest them with some kind of American feeling, which is catchy tunes, easily comprehensible tunes, a lot of excitement and brilliance, because the Europeans had contempt for America. In the mid-19th century, America stood for just material wealth. All Americans were concerned about was the mighty dollar. We were the height of materialism, as opposed to the spiritual objectives of other places, Europe.
America finds its way first in the visual arts. We have important painters by that time. I'm very interested in Frederick Church, who's the iconic American painter beginning in the 1850s, the same decade that we've been talking about. Church is important because he establishes landscape as the iconic genre for an American visual aesthetic, right? So his landscapes, they preach two sermons. One is about science and one is about God. For him, nature manifests the divine, and he's also a very, very sharp scientific, empirical observer of nature.
On May 10, 1849, 2 months after the inauguration of President Zachary Taylor, a bitter rivalry erupted between traditionalists and reformists. The traditionalists, who favored the British approach to Shakespeare, clashed with those advocating for a uniquely American interpretation of the bard's work. This conflict revealed a larger struggle that included a debate over cultural identity. Bristow, known for his support of a greater presence of American composers in New York's concert halls, was part of a larger movement challenging the transatlantic dominance in American music. Given his proximity to the events, it's reasonable to imagine he witnessed firsthand the tragic violence of the Astor Place riot, the events that sealed the fate of so many in one of the bloodiest riots in New York's history, where cultural and class struggles erupted in conflict. At the same time, Europe was grappling with political and identity issues that were fueling the growing unrest. This continental bloodbath spanned from the Paris Commune to Copenhagen, the Italian War of Unification, and the Serb Revolution. From the massacre in Lyon to the Hungarian Revolution and the Polish revolts. The process of shaping national identities was often loud, chaotic, and violent. Revolutionary ideals were overflowing across borders, igniting passions and struggles. And on that fateful day of May 10, 1849, at least 20 people paid with their lives the price of cultural pride and class struggle. The aspirations for reform found fertile ground in New York, particularly in circles greatly influenced by the overwhelming presence of German immigrants, who had initially contributed to shaping the city's cultural landscape. Artistic expressions rooted in Europe, especially the distinct German influence, played a central role in this transformation. At the same time, the struggle to forge an American cultural identity was taking place elsewhere. In New Orleans, Louis Moreau Gottschalk was building on African, French, Spanish, and Creole traditions, creating a sound that reflected the cultural tapestry of a port city exposed to the rhythms, spices, and colors of the Caribbean.
The first thing that comes to mind about classical music in New York in the 1840s is the visit of the Germania Orchestra. This is an earthquake. These are first-rate young symphonic musicians fleeing the revolutions of 1848 in Europe, and they constitute the first, you could say, world-class orchestra that Americans ever heard. And they make an immense impression. They tour widely, and as they tour, members of the Germania Orchestra are deposited in American cities. In New York, it's Carl Bergman. And Bergman becomes the leading conductor in New York. Of course, you have the founding of the New York Philharmonic in 1842. In some ways, a misleading landmark because it's a musicians' co-op that performs very infrequently. Bergman becomes their conductor, but it's really not until Gustav Mahler, way, way later, after the turn of the 20th century, that it becomes a full-time orchestra. This postdates the founding of other American orchestras, most notably the orchestras in Boston and Chicago, which are world-class ensembles, long before the New York Philharmonic.
Changes in the character of the music scene were also fueled by new possibilities, new instruments, new factories, and new access. Workshops in Germany produced vast numbers of affordable violins for export, putting violins into more American hands than ever before. With the introduction of the cast iron frame, the piano was transformed into its modern form, expanding its possibilities and its power. And with these forces in motion, New York only grew more powerful.
The democratization of musical culture is essential to this story. Before the modern piano, if you wanted to play any string instrument, guitar, violin, you had to tune it, which means you had to have a pitch recognition. On a violin or cello, you had 4 strings you had to tune in an interval, right? If you don't hear the difference, right, you can't tune the instrument. And there are no frets, which means if I want to play do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, I have to put my fingers in the right place that it sounds right. I have to sing it. The same ability to sing, as we say, carry a tune. And musical ability is not uniformly distributed. It means it requires more or less teaching. The piano was a miracle because the piano was the first instrument of mechanical reproduction that was reliable. The American piano of the 1860s and 70s had a metal frame, a very secure pin block, and it didn't go out of tune every day. When Mozart got up every morning and he had his fortepiano, he had to tune it every single day.
Concert hall ensembles, opera singers, teachers, and luthiers arrived, joined by touring companies passing through, planting the seeds of what we now call show business. Louis-Antoine Jullien, the flamboyant French conductor and showman, arrived in New York with 27 of his finest players, the vanguard of a grand orchestra nearly 100 strong. Those who had only read about his extravagant concerts in Europe now rushed to see him perform at Castle Garden on the southernmost tip of Manhattan. 41, tall and theatrical, Julien was already a legend. Upon arrival, he began to audition, and George Bristow, then 28, was enrolled in the orchestra. Like many other conductors, Julien commissioned local composers to create original works for his performances. He hired Bristow to compose a symphony for which he paid him handsomely. Within just a few weeks, Bristow delivered his Symphony No. 2 in D minor, Opus 24, later known simply as the Julien. Critics noticed echoes of Mendelssohn and Schumann, remarks that Julien dismissed, insisting that what truly mattered was that an American composer had written a symphony, and that a world-class orchestra had performed it to thunderous applause. While George Bristow and others struggled on the written page to challenge European preeminence in the concert halls of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, a different tune altogether was brewing in the kitchens of Five Points and along the Bowery. If world audiences were to open themselves to the sounds emerging from the United States, it would not be through symphonies modeled on the Old World, but through the melodies of Stephen Collins Foster, whose Songbook of fundamental American melodies captured the imagination of millions from the Far East to Europe and South America. If an American musical identity was brewing in New York in the mid-1800s, it was most probably not in grand orchestras mirroring European models, but in a new form shaped by constraint, by sentiment, and by the emotional weight of working-class streets and marginalized communities. Ultimately, this will be recipe for the global expansion of an American sound that will transform the way we feel and relate to music and the concept of cultural identity.
Bristow's opera, Rip Van Winkle, was the first opera based on an American subject. And so it was a big deal. This is earlier in his career. Right here, 5 miles north of me, is the Rip Van Winkle Bridge. And you go across that to the Catskills, which are right out there. And that's Rip Van Winkle country. That's Washington Irving country up there, so.
Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving was a short story published in 1819. It captured the American imagination for the next 2 generations. It was widely reprinted, memorized, and performed in theaters across the country. This is the story of a man who fell asleep while America was still a British colony, only to wake up 20 years later and learn of the American Revolution. Bristow was deeply familiar with the story and used it as the basis for his first lyric drama, an opera in 3 acts, which premiered in New York on September 27, 1855. By the mid-1850s, Native American life and culture had gained visibility within the artistic community of New York and the United States. Yet, in other parts of the Americas, such narratives had already reached the operatic stage as central dramatic themes. In 1870, the Brazilian opera Il Guarani premiered at La Scala in Milan to a standing ovation. The opera, by Antonio Carlos Gomes, tells of a romance between an indigenous warrior prince and the daughter of a Portuguese nobleman, an unmistakably new world story told through the language of Italian opera. Il Guarani confronts the encounter of worlds. Its argument is unmistakably American, indigenous and European, land and empire, miscegenation and myth. It speaks in Italian, yet its subject cannot be transplanted. In opera, where narrative, spectacle, and landscape converge, such themes become visible. In the United States, however, a distinctly American operatic discourse emerged hesitantly. It was not in symphonic abstraction, but in staged drama that the absence was most apparent. Only with the advent of cinema, opera continued by other means, did the continent's geography and peoples move decisively to center stage. Hundreds of men, women, and children were brought from reservations to appear in large-scale productions. Many had been born before reservation life itself. What began as a spectacle now stands as an unintended anthropological record, among the earliest moving images to document Native American life.
Going to an orchestra concert in the 1880s was like going to the movies in the 1950s. Technicolor, big sound, exciting. It could have been stupid, but it was an hour and a half of complete detachment from reality. People sat in their seats and they daydreamed. What has been the death of the classical music concert? Not rock and roll, not hip hop, not rap. The sound movie. Because suddenly I bought a ticket, place was dark, and I exited into fantasy land with language and sound. Before the sound movie, there was a called silent movie, which was never silent. There was always somebody playing music, right? Okay, so that was fun, but this was much better. That's why a symphony concert was just a sensual experience. You had all these noises coming from the stage, which were beautiful and sort of transported you.
$75,000. Might be difficult to get that many volunteers.
During the American Civil War, Bristow took part in a series of fundraising concerts, lending his music and his name to efforts supporting the Volunteer Fund. That war was the deadliest in the nation's history, claiming more than 12 times as many lives as the American Revolution in barely half the time. Nearly 750,000 Americans lost their lives during the conflict.
I once fell in love with one of my pupils. I later learned she was married. Still, I dedicated a nocturne to her, calling it La Belle of America. The nocturne was much admired and sought after, and I attributed its success to my devotion. Encouraged by this, I decided to follow the same formula and wrote a nocturne each time I fell in love.
Judging by the number of nocturnes, our Romeo was in love several times. His first marriage, to Harriet Newell Crane of Newark, New Jersey, resulted in a widely publicized episode following her numerous infidelities with multiple partners. The scandal humiliated Bristow, as testimonies describing her abandoned and wicked conduct were released to the press and published in the local media.
Surrender, my poor army.
Peace for the nation and for Bristow will come hand in hand. In 1864, he married Louise Holder, a soprano singer, a widow, and a close collaborator, and the woman who will become the love of his life. The newlywed moved to Morrisania across the Harlem River. An elementary school named after the composer stands on a street that also bears his name. The school was likely named after the street, though few recall whom the street itself honors. Yet a more righteous tribute may lie in what now seems as one of the most diverse human clusters in the world, a living tapestry of racial, ethnic, and linguistic density. Perhaps the pursuit of a true cultural identity has been a chimera from the start. What does it mean to be an American then and today? The idea of forging an American identity, musical or otherwise, may no longer align with the pace at which transformations unfold within the ever-changing fabric of American society today.
The church taught me that order serves feeling, that discipline shapes devotion, and I was raised in the hush of sacred music. In composing for the altar, I learned that sound could lift the spirit, that clarity and restraint might convey what words alone could not.
Bristow devoted himself to church work on the Lower East Side, serving as organist, choirmaster, and composer. In the late 1850s, following the widespread success of Mendelssohn's Elijah, Bristow undertook Daniel, an oratorio modeled on a work he knew well and had previously conducted. Elijah offered him a compelling example of how a biblical subject could sustain serious musical treatment in the American concert hall. His turn to Daniel coincided with a period in which he became increasingly devoted to sacred music, suggesting a shift toward inward reflection as much as public engagement. While the work reflects his continuing interest in the place of American composers within an inherited tradition, it also marks a more personal chapter, one shaped by moral gravity rather than public dispute. In the figure of Daniel, accused, exposed, yet steadfast, the story would have carried particular resonance at this moment. It is not difficult to imagine Bristow responding to a narrative of judgment endured, conscience preserved, and faith maintained in a society quick to condemn and slow to forgive.
Now, Bristow has always gotten kind of short shrift from the music history business. The generation that came after Bristow, Chadwick and Payne and Horatio Parker and Amy Beach have always gotten a lot, in recent decades, gotten a lot more attention, and everybody forgets Bristow. But I had this symphony in my mind, and I said I would only teach a course on the American Symphony if I could include Bristow. And so I did some research, found out all of his papers at the New York Public Library. So I went down to New York, found the score to the Fourth Symphony, the Arcadian, and tried to Xerox it or print it out for microfiche. None of that worked, but I figured out I could photograph the entire thing with my phone. Bristow's handwriting is sometimes maddening. I think this is double fortissimo. This is double forte. That's 2 Fs, and this is definitely 2 Fs. Different instruments than we use now. Clarinet, and this is clarinet in A, but sometimes he uses clarinet in C. He's got horns here in E and horn in G, and it's really difficult to tell what some of those letters are. I'm pretty sure that's G. No, I mean the Arcadian. The very title of it refers to the American wilderness and the idea that there was some kind of paradise out there that hadn't been ruined by man yet, hadn't been civilized, and the whole thing. The piece starts off. It's the only symphony I know of that starts off with a solo viola. And the solo viola comes back twice more in the first movement. It plays the main theme by itself, and then the orchestra picks it up. And then after, there's all these bunch of big climaxes and everything, and then the solo viola comes in again, and it plays that main theme as kind of a mournful waltz. And it's accompanied by pizzicato strings. And it's a really interesting effect. I don't know of anything in the classical repertoire quite like it. And then at the end of the movement, you get the solo viola again, and it's like exhausted, and the movement dies away with this wonderful last flourish by the solo viola. And that solo viola is clearly an American going out into the wilderness by himself, and that's the first part of the symphony. The Arcadian Symphony, I think it's kind of about the American myth, because Bristow was a New Yorker. He spent his whole career in New York. But everyone was aware of the American trek westward and the stories about people going out. The second movement is not just, it's about a family going west. It starts off with, it has a hymn, Thomas Tallis's Evening Hymn, played by a brass quartet. And it's very solemn, very church-like, completely straight, with no classical music additions to it. And it comes back, it happens twice in the second movement. The second time, first time it's very straight. Second time, it's got all these little flute staccatos and little whirling things in the violins, and it's like they're in a field with butterflies and lightning bugs and everything. It's very colorful. It's really delightful.
When Bristow was working on his Fourth Symphony, the Tallis Canon referenced by Kyle was one of the most widely sung hymns in America. A 16th century English melody that had crossed the Atlantic only a few decades before his parents had become part of the spiritual fabric of American families. Perhaps his choosing of this particular hymn was Bristow's way of acknowledging his lineage. A fitting choice, a tune rooted in the past, offered as a gesture of devotion and hope.
Fry was 10 or 15 years older than Bristow, and he was working as a music critic. He was very outspoken. He wrote some strange music. The piece he's best known for is called the Santa Claus Symphony, and it is a very literal tone poem about Christmas night with angels singing, Santa Claus coming down the chimney. It's very fun. It ought to be on children's programs. And Fry wrote a Niagara Symphony. It's an odd piece, and he tried to capture the roar of Niagara Falls. Because if you've been to Niagara Falls, the impressive thing to me is the volume of it. It's loud. 3 miles away, you hear this rushing and everything. Then Bristow decided to base his Fifth Symphony on Niagara. So the Symphony number 5, it's a huge symphony. It's like Mahler, and the fourth movement has a chorus like Beethoven's Ninth. And it's also, the third movement is called a breakdown, and it makes reference to Southern African Americans dancing and singing and stuff like that. It's kind of a picture of all America, even though Niagara is the main topic of it. So.
George Bristow's Fifth Symphony, the Niagara, was first performed on April 11, 1898 at Carnegie Hall. Just 1 week later, the Spanish-American War began, and public attention shifted abruptly toward a new era of American global ambition. The Treaty of Paris, formally ending the war, was signed on December 10, 1898. 3 days later, Bristow was pronounced dead, having suffered a heart attack while teaching school children in a public school in Lower Manhattan.
His work was not in vain. He's part of a trajectory that really led somewhere. I feel the trajectory peaks in the 1890s. It's my frustration that we don't really pick up on it after the First World War. You know, the modernists were invested in the new. It was hard to look back. There had been immense carnage. And no longer was the dominant project of American classical music finding an American voice in American composition. The iconic figure was Arturo Toscanini, the great conductor who conducts Beethoven and Brahms, who's not even an American citizen. The composers are traveling now in a backseat. They know it. They resent it. Bristow could never have anticipated that. Nobody did. Dvorak, Seidel, Theodore Thomas, Henry Higginson, none of these people in the 1890s could have anticipated that this project would be sidelined. They all assumed that American classical music would generate an American canon, and that American canon would be primary for American orchestras. It never happened.
The truth is that they have never commanded major public attention, important as they have been historically. No one is doing music by these composers today. There is a tragedy to that, because my encounter with the Bristow symphonies is very positive. It was exciting for me and for the players to learn and put on the stage a very well-written, very beautiful, very fine piece of music that told something about America's image of itself, kind of triumphant, confident America, which no longer exists. And in many of these pieces, you do hear a democratic ethos, the idea of writing for a large public where there is no landed aristocracy. Now, we have a country now that has oligarchs, but we've returned to a feudal world, but that's an iron of history which we need to help undo. But the sort of hint of egalitarianism you can see in the clarity and the simplicity, if you will, of Bristow's form and his tunes and what he does with orchestration. It's music that can be liked on first hearing.
On January 30th, 2026, Niagara was performed for a new generation of New Yorkers, including students from P.S. George Bristow in the Bronx, who met for the first time the music behind the name of their school. As we stepped out of Carnegie Hall, a question followed us into the night. What is it that continues to drive this tantalizing quest for an American cultural identity? An identity that so often feels within reach, yet shifts the very moment we attempt to define it.
Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, Perú, Ecuador, Brasil, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Panamá, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador.
Far from a relic, George Frederick Bristow has become part of the fabric, one thread in an ever-evolving tapestry that, a century later, has given the world some of the most extraordinary music it has ever known. And in that sense, he stands within a constellation of men and women who have given this nation its voice, a voice that now resonates far beyond its borders, inviting the world to play along.